Jerry and his wife Megan and daughter Laura were driving to a new restaurant that opened up in their town. The restaurant was right in the centre of town, and the drive was about 20 minutes. They were so happy on the drive there because they rarely had the chance to go out together as a family, as Jerry's work hours were so long. When they arrived at the restaurant, they admired the outside. They had a great appetite worked up. They spoke until the waiter came, then put in their orders. When the food came, they loved it so much. After the meal, they were so full up, they hardly were able to have the dessert, but they still managed to eat ice cream and devour it. Laura went to wash her hands, and on her way she admired a beautiful little door on the hall wall. She remembered the name from her friend. It was a fairy door. She thought she saw something move behind the little window on the door. There was just a tiny little hole letting her look in. She put her eyes up to it and looked in the background. She took out her phone, shining the flashlight, illuminating a room where she saw people sitting down with a cloth over their mouth. She was too frightened to wash her hands and ran back and told her mom and dad. They thought she was just imagining things, but she kept telling them what she saw and to call the police. But they just ignored her, because she was that type of girl that had a good imagination and a lot of ghost stories. So her mom and dad thought that this was just another one of them. Jerry was on his way to the bathroom when he had decided to take a look, just in case. He was wondering why he did, but when he did, he couldn't believe his eyes. Just as he looked, he could see something cover the hole, but he knew what he saw before it was covered. Exactly what Laura had described. Jerry rang the police, and it was later discovered that the meat in the restaurant were actually humans, and the owners were cannibals that enjoyed knowing their customers were eating humans without realizing it. The whole town were shocked when they realized that the Bane clan were actually killing humans and cooking them to serve the customers. It was right under their eyes, even in the name, as Bane clan was an anagram for the cannibal. Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you want to stay up to date on new content, then please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell to be notified on new content. It was a cold, damp, still night. The first night I had visited the pub all year. On my way home, I decided to take a shortcut that a friend had told me about, through a narrow alleyway just off my usual path. I had to shrug past a briar patch to get to it. Hood up, I walked through the alley, head down. The slight splash of my steps on the wet concrete echoed off the walls on either side, and the orange light of a distant flickering street lamp reflected off the water. After a while, the alleyway veered to the left. I followed it, and then I started to notice that my footsteps seemed to be repeating. I felt an uneasiness creep into my mind. Someone was following me. I glanced behind me. Sure enough, someone was there, in shadow. The alleyway went on without any hint of an end, and continued to veer to the left. The footsteps behind me started to quicken. I couldn't ignore my sudden sense of panic. I just knew I had to get out of the alley, but there somehow didn't seem to be an end to it. I started to run, but when I looked behind, my pursuer had already gained on me. I tried to run faster, but the alley ahead seemed to almost stretch away further. As I twisted my neck again to see my follower, I tripped and slammed onto my chest on the wet, cold alley slabs. A patter of heavy footsteps stopped next to my face, down ahead. A hand grabbed me by the shoulder, and a voice asked, "Sorry, do you know how to get out of here?" I recognized the voice. I turned and looked up at the person who had chased me down, and to my shock, I realized that the person was me. Then everything went black. Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you want to stay up to date on new content, then please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell to be notified on new content.
On September 16th, 1992, at approximately 3:45 p.m., 8-year-old Katie Laring left the Becker residence at 265 Harper's Way. She was on her bike, described by her mother as pink with white and purple stickers on it. According to Erica Becker, her piano teacher, with whom Katie had been most of the afternoon, Katie rode south in the direction of her home directly after leaving the house. The search began at 7 p.m., with police and volunteers scouring the woods which surrounded the Laring property. Katie's parents were too distraught to join the search party the first day, but were insistent on taking part for the following 3 days and nights. On the fourth day, Mr. Laring did not join his wife. He spent the night at a bar just outside of town, coming home only to pack his bags. He left without conversation, simply telling his wife he couldn't live there anymore and had nothing to offer but his grief. Though the police suspected him, his wife never did. Mr. Laring left against the advice of his lawyer. His body was found only 2 days later, a few miles west. He had died of an opioid overdose and was found in his car. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Mrs. Laring saw her daughter sitting on the living room couch. She'd been woken by a sudden nausea and was headed to the bathroom. The girl, who was barely visible in the dark, did not respond to her mother's calls. Mrs. Laring claims she believed this to be her daughter's ghost. There was nothing of life in her at all, she would later tell police. Yet she knew it was Katie, and so she approached, an arm out ahead, dreading the moment when the phantom would vanish. Before reaching out, she noted the girl's size. She seemed to be twice as big as Katie, and yet Mrs. Laring recognized her. To her astonishment, when her hand reached the girl, it was not shadow or cold air she felt on her palm, but flesh. It was not a ghost, but Katie's decomposing corpse that sat upright, mouth agape in the living room now. The nausea she felt had been due to the smell. It would take her another 2 days to call the police. I couldn't let them take her away again, she would later recount to the local newspaper. The rumors started soon after. At first, everyone was sorry for her. Such a cruel thing for the killer to do, to bring her own dead daughter's body back in such a state. But concern turned to fear when some began to question whether that was what happened. Maybe she had found her daughter's body in a shallow grave in the woods and dug it up herself. Worse still, some pondered if maybe she was the one who killed her in the first place. The police never charged her or anyone else with the girl's death or the body's desecration. There wasn't enough evidence for either. The autopsy concluded the girl died of a cardiac arrest, but the body was too deteriorated for further analysis. It wasn't long before the town turned on the mother, shunning her from society entirely. For months, no one spoke to her. The only contact she had was with the mailman, who couldn't help but stay and chat when she would make conversation. She was desperate to connect, he claimed when speaking to reporters. He continued, "For what it's worth, I never felt anything dark from her. If I had any thought that she'd killed her daughter, I wouldn't have felt a single ounce of pity for the woman." "4 months later, Mrs. Trumbo passed away in her sleep. She was 89 and had been ill for some time. The funeral went as expected, friends and family, hushed conversations. 14 days later, her body was found sitting at the kitchen table of her daughter's home. She had been embalmed and was much better preserved than Katie Laring. Her daughter, who had found her, had no answers for the police. She moved out of town less than a month later. The townspeople's fear of Mrs. Laring became a general fear, which infected every part of daily life, and was the talk of almost all conversations with no assailant or perpetrator to point to. There had been no desecration of the grave site. Investigators had to exhume the coffin. It was shut, the inside clean. No marks or scratches on the wood. There were no signs that there had ever been a body inside. Some even went on to call the burial a hoax. To those who had not been at the cemetery, believing this was a comfort. But for the ones who had attended, there was no such relief. They watched the body lowered into the earth with their own eyes. For them, there was no explanation. The investigators checked the funeral home for signs of foul play, but even then they admitted it would only serve as evidence of Mrs. Trumbo's case, not Katie Laring's. Regardless, no such evidence was found. When a third death was announced in the town paper, the entire town was on pins and needles. The funeral was sparsely attended, with all eyes glancing at the body for signs of movement. The wife of the deceased, a Mrs. Henry, insisted on being present as the casket was closed, and every inch of the way from the funeral home to its final resting place at McKinley Cemetery. She was at her husband's side the entire time, and when asked by a local reporter how she felt, she told him she was confident nothing strange would happen, explaining that after the body was lowered into the grave, she had paid a construction company to pour cement over the coffin. She even joked that she would have simply cremated him if he had not hated the idea while he was alive. Demand for cremations rose over 200% in the following months. Mrs. Henry's precautions seemed to have worked, but none of the town's residents seemed willing to risk it. 9 months after Mr. Henry's burial, just as the stories were becoming a memory, Mrs. Henry woke to find her husband's remains lying beside her in bed. Investigators concluded he had been lying there for at least 6 hours before he was discovered. The concrete grave remained untouched. The exhumation, which took 2 days, revealed an intact coffin, same as the previous cases. With no leads to follow, the 2 detectives assigned to the case went back to Mrs. Laring, who refused to speak to them, stating that when she was grieving most, the police had only treated her as a suspect. As they were leaving the property, she reminded them that there was no evidence a human being had killed her daughter. When they asked what she believed it had been that took her, she said she had no earthly idea what it was, but she knew where it lived. woods," she said, pointing to the trees surrounding her backyard. She told them she heard it every night since she had found her daughter's corpse, laughing. Every night, save for when the bodies of the dead were discovered in their homes. Those nights, she told the detectives, were the only times there was no laughing behind the trees.
Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you want to stay up to date on new content, then please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell to be notified on new content. Mandy was an inspiring writer who had an agent with interest in a manuscript she had wrote. The manuscript showed potential, but wasn't publishing worthy, were her agent's words. Mandy felt a surge of excitement at the very fact her agent was ready and willing to give her a chance. But her agent stressed that she would have to come up with a whole new manuscript that proved she was a writer that had the talent to write a novel that had the potential to be a bestseller. Mandy was a carer to a very ill world-famous writer. His name was Arnold Starr. He had a string of best-selling novels, and lots of them were turned into movies. Arnold kept telling Mandy that he had his best work hidden away, and only she knew about it, but asked her to give the manuscript to his agent in the event of him dying. He gave her a key code to get into the room that the manuscript was hidden in, and he promised her that no one knew about the manuscript, not even his agent. One summer evening, Arnold passed away peacefully in his bed. Mandy had did exactly what Arnold had asked of her, and put in the code and retrieved his manuscript. She was about to call his agent when a crazy idea entered her head. What if she kept the manuscript and gave it to her agent? That night in her own home, she rang her agent and said, "Hi, I have great news. I'm finished my manuscript and I am so happy with it. I took your advice and tried my best to prove to you that you're right, that I have the talent to write a potential bestseller." After the call, Mandy settled down with a glass of wine and read the manuscript. It was exciting and gripping from the opening line. On the last page, she was surprised as she read, "There was a spirit in the house of a girl called Mandy. They wanted revenge for a wrong she did, to get even from something she took belonged to them." Mandy thought she heard a noise in her stairs, but as frightened as she was by feeling a cold sting in the air and what she had just read, she felt forced to read on. So she did. The words staring up at her were, "The noise stopped in the stairs, and the spirit knocked on the door." Suddenly the door swung open, and Mandy was shocked to see Arnold standing right at the door. He looked right at her, and his stare made her drop dead. His spirit disappeared. A few days later, Mandy's agent found the manuscript, and about a year later it was published as Mandy's first and only book, and it went on to become a #1 bestseller, which was always Mandy's dream. Thanks for watching The Assassin Rapper, and if you want to stay up to date on new content, then please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell to be notified on new content.